A second district in Limpopo is dealing with a measles outbreak. The National Institute for Communicable Diseases says there are 3 cases in Giyani in the Mopani district municipality. The first outbreak was declared in Sekhukhune district, meaning that there now is a total of 15 infections in those areas, combined infections. The NICD is encouraging the public to vaccinate against measles. But let's get you the latest on this now. We're joined by Dr. Kerrigan McCarthy, who is a pathologist at the NICD this morning. Dr. McCarthy, once again, good morning. Thanks for joining us. So the criteria for an outbreak has now been met in these areas.
Yes, thank you. So there are theoretical criteria for an outbreak. The WHO and various other international authorities and our own experience have defined that an outbreak is when 3 or more cases occur in a health district within 1 month. Now, in the current context, we need to look more broadly than the definitions on paper. We need to be aware that in Sekhukhune there are, as you report, 15, but there is the mounting tally, and there are cases in Mopani. There are also cases, 2 cases in Vembe district, and we have a massive outbreak on our borders in Zimbabwe. And so, rather than focusing on the technicalities of is there an outbreak or is there not an outbreak, we need to look at the broader context and respond appropriately. And
what is that broader context? In terms of vaccinations, is that something that's right at the top of the list in terms of response?
So measles is easily preventable by a safe and thoroughly effective vaccine. Persons who are vaccinated with measles have a 99% lifetime protection against infection with minimal side effects. And one of the key ways of preventing measles is to ensure that at least 85% of the population is vaccinated against measles. For various reasons, one of them is COVID and reduced attendance at public healthcare facilities. Many members of the public have not ensured that their family members, their children are vaccinated. And then, of course, from the Department of Health side, there are issues around budgetary constraints and limited spending in particular areas that may have contributed to supply chain issues and procurement. So these have contributed to an under-vaccination in the population. The Department of Health calculates the vaccination coverage as a function of the number of doses that are administered over the estimated mid-year population size. And across the country, these do not attain to 85%. Some provinces have lower vaccination coverage than others. So this is the context into which these relatively few sounding cases of measles occur. Now, measles is one of the most infectious viruses known to humankind. It's far more infectious than SARS-CoV-2. We talk about the reproductive number of measles being 11. So for every single case of measles, there are likely to be 11 secondary cases in a completely unvaccinated population. So that's a crude measure of how infectious measles is, whereas SARS-CoV-2 will have between 3 and 8. Influenza will have 3 secondary cases. So, when we hear of a few cases of measles in a population, it is absolutely critical to respond rapidly with what we call ring vaccination. That's where all the known contacts of the case are vaccinated immediately on suspicion of measles, followed by a broader vaccination campaign with a targeted age range. So this is what the Limpopo provincial government is working towards with the assistance of the National Department.
As clinicians, as members of the public, what should we be looking out for in terms of symptoms?
Good question. So measles has what we call a prodrome, where individuals experience symptoms that are quite non-specific. So in children, these would be a fever, a general restlessness. If they're old enough to talk, they'll be complaining of myalgias and feeling discomfort and tiredness. There are also respiratory symptoms. So a cough is classic, and then what they call coryza, which is a runny nose, and redness of eyes, conjunctivitis. on the fourth day of the prodrome, the rash appears. So up until that point, it can present like any other flu-like illness, but when the rash appears, it's usually indicative of measles. The rash usually appears first on the head and neck and shoulders. It's a patchy rash. It's not bumps. You can't feel it when you run your hand over it. And we call it a macular-papular rash. And the person is in 4 days before the onset of the rash until 4 days afterwards. At this point, it's absolutely critical that a person present for a diagnosis. The healthcare practitioner can take a blood test. We can look for antibodies. They can also take a nasopharyngeal swab, much like we took for COVID. And in fact, that's the best specimen. We do a PCR test like we do a PCR test for passport.
And the complications, Dr. McCarthy, are incredibly serious, even death.
Yes. So, in older children, measles is generally, though there are exceptions, an uncomplicated illness, and one recovers uneventfully. But the problem is that because measles is so infectious, it's often passed on to people who are vulnerable. And this is where the problem with measles lies. So, many people will say, I had measles, my child can have measles. But it's a problem for the whole of society in this sense that children under the age of 1 year of age, children who are malnourished, and there are increasing rates of malnourishment amongst children in our country following COVID and the economic situation we find ourselves in. Persons who are living with HIV or untreated, undiagnosed HIV, persons who are immunocompromised through either chemotherapy or cancers, or the elderly. These persons can get measles pneumonia and they die. In the pre-HIV era, I was involved in looking after a children's home where there were 30 children, 11 of whom died from measles pneumonia. It's a devastating illness for persons who are vulnerable. And we as a society owe it to the more vulnerable members of our community in order to ensure that we are vaccinated, that our children receive the correct vaccinations at the right age to protect those people in our society who will be vulnerable.
Yeah. Important point to note, Dr. McCarthy, if you are uncertain about your vaccination status, it's never too late to get vaccinated, correct? And the other issue, just around what you've just said, how much of a worry is that segment of society, the term usually used to refer to them as anti-vaxxers? What would be your message to them?
Vaccination is a complicated issue. At the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what is driving our perspective on vaccination. The sociological research has shown that many persons who are uncomfortable with vaccination are wavering. They're sitting on the fence. And the factors such as trust are tied up with hesitancy to vaccinate, and particularly trust in public health authorities. I think it's important for each person to examine our own motives and to understand what our thinking is around vaccination, and to uncover the drivers. If it is trust in authorities, we need to disentangle why we fail to trust the authorities, and is vaccination and the health of our children and our community something that is independent of the authorities, or is it tied up with the functioning of our health system? So it's a complicated issue, and I would encourage an open-minded approach to rather than a judgmental approach to people who are sitting on the fence. It is an area of increasing growth, where the understanding on the drivers and the psychology behind the reluctance to take up vaccinations is growing, and it's something that scientists need to factor in terms of how we communicate and how we engender trust in the science around protection, and how we communicate to the public.
Yeah, certainly. Especially, I suppose, because it's a personal choice, some would argue, but as you've mentioned in our discussion, it affects the broader community. That choice that you think is very personal.
It's absolutely correct. There's a famous saying, no man is an island, no person is an island. We don't live for ourselves. The choices we make affect others. And science really is a tool to help us understand how best to bring about the best outcome for us all. And as such, it needs to be taken.
Dr. Kerrigan McCarthy, let me thank you for your time this morning, a pathologist at the NICD, as we continue to track the measles outbreak that is currently unfolding in Limpopo. Very